Okay, I think it's 2 o'clock. It's time to make a start. Good afternoon, everybody. Really warm welcome to you all. Welcome to this afternoon's request to pay, lead or lag session. Today's webinar is sponsored by AnswerPay. My name's Julian Wells. I'm Director of FinTech North. I'm really delighted to be hosting the session this afternoon. If you are looking to learn more about request to pay, or if it's an area that you're already involved in and you want to get a bit of an update, then you've come to the right place. We've got some excellent speakers that you'll hear from this afternoon. We will have about 45 minutes of the session which will be dedicated to hearing from the speakers directly, and then the intention is to have some time for questions and answers towards the end. I just would like to run through briefly who you'll hear from today. So I've introduced myself already. First of all, we'll hear from Sadiq Kundu from Accenture. We've got Nigel Reevely from FIS, Mike Chambers from AnswerPay, and Nigel Gardner from Answer Digital. So we will get on with the show. I'm delighted to. In fact, before I do that, just let me reflect on some of the topics we're going to talk about. As I said earlier on, you've come to the right place if you want to know a bit more about request to pay, whatever level of knowledge you might already have. You will get the full story so far. We'll reflect on some of the recent developments, in particular in Europe, in relation to request to pay. Look at some of the differences between the UK and the European model. Talk about opportunities and adoption challenges, and then also we will address the question of the webinar, which is to lead or lag. So we'll come to that right at the end once we've heard from all the speakers. So I'll try again. I'd like to introduce Sadiq from Accenture, and Sadiq is going to introduce us to request to pay and get the session off. Thank you, Sadiq. Welcome.
Hello. Thanks, Julian, and hello, everyone. I am Sudipta Kundu. I'm a senior manager in Accenture's payments practice, and I have been involved in developing some of the standards for UK's request to pay framework. So very excited to be here today to share some of my personal perspective on the topic, and also to listen to your thoughts and view on this. If you move to the next slide, please. Request to pay is not just a topic that is relevant to the UK or the European geography. Its potential benefits can be applied to any bill payment industry across the world. And hence we are seeing that a number of request to pay or similar initiatives are gaining traction in different geographies. Some of these are at early stages of development, whereas some of the initiatives are already quite matured and well established in their geographies. So if you look at the left-hand side of the slides, in the UK last year, we saw that Pay.UK has launched the request to pay standards for the industry. Later in the year, we also saw the first version of SEPA request to pay scheme rulebook, which was effectively released earlier this month. And similarly, in the North America, the clearinghouse is also driving the new bill pay experience, which is essentially request for payment over their real-time payments network. So all these are similar propositions which allow billers to send a request or invoice digitally to their customers, and customers can then make payments towards it through some flexible options. Now, if you look at the right-hand side of the slides, especially in geographies like Australia, there is already a request to pay solution available. It's called BPay, which provides similar functionalities as request to pay. And roughly 60,000 businesses in Australia provide this service to more than 50% of the population. So it is the most popular bill payment mechanism in that geography. Also, Singapore has launched its request to pay solution, which is Pay Collect in 2018. And that solution is available in that geography via the network of the largest financial institutes in this region. And also in the Nordics, there is a omni billing solution, which is again an API-based request to pay solution, which is quite well established in that market. And the reason the request to pay or these initiatives are gaining so much traction or being so popular in this in different geographies is that it addresses some of the key pain points or the gaps in the current bill payment industry. So if we move to the next slide, please. If you look at or consider the bill payments journey today, there are a number of inefficiencies which creates problems for both billers and payers. The first one being lack of transparency. So when a biller sends an invoice today, the biller does not get any visibility of what is happening with the invoice, whether the customer is going to make the payment or when the customer is going to make the payment. And that has some implications on billers' cash flow management. Similarly, if you think from a payer's point of view, the customers does not have or do not have many options to discuss with the billers if they are facing any difficulties with their financial situation to make the bill payment of, or if they have difficulty in understanding the invoice itself. So that creates a lot of problems often for the customers, and customers are not always able to negotiate the alternative arrangements for payments that could help or could suit their financial situation. The third problem we have is lack of flexibility and control. Now imagine if a customer receives an invoice today and doesn't have the fund or sufficient fund available to make the payment within the due date. There are 3-4 things can happen in this scenario. First, if there is a direct debit set up in that account or to make that bill payment, the direct debit will fail. The customer's account can go into overdraft, or the customer may end up paying a late payment fee for that invoice. In any of these situations, there is a cost impact both to the payer as well as to the biller, because there is a cost associated with collecting failed direct debits. There are costs associated with handling late payments, and late payment also has an impact on the biller's cash flow. So in summary, the lack of flexibility and control creates a lot of cost challenges on both sides for billers and payers. And finally, there are not many alternatives to collect payments. Majority of the British billers prefer to collect payment via direct debit, but a huge portion of the UK consumers don't use direct debit as a payment mechanism. So in such scenarios, the biller only have the option to collect one-off payments via the card rails. And this has some implications to the biller. First, the card rails are expensive. And the second thing is the one-off payments often come with manual errors. For example, the customer may miss the invoice number. The customer may put an incorrect invoice number. Now, reallocating those invoices or those payments to the correct invoices and reconciling them is also an overhead and a cost challenge for the biller. So if you look at the all these inefficiencies together, the bill payment experience today is quite painful for customers and quite expensive for the billers. And request to pay can help to address some of these challenges. So if we look at the typical request to pay journey, can you move to the next slide, please? Yeah. So a typical request to pay journey starts with biller sending a digital invoice to the customer. Now, by sending the digital invoice, billers can automatically get rid of some of the costs associated with paper processing, which can help billers to reduce some of their operating costs. And when the customer receives the request to pay a message from the biller, the customer can either respond to the biller by accepting it or declining it. For example, if the customer has already made the payment via another channel, the customer can decline the request. If the customer does not recognize the bill, the customer can also decline the invoice or the request from the biller. And the customer can also ask for more information from the biller on the invoice if they have difficulty in understanding it. And the customer can also request for extension of the due date if unable to meet them. So what does that mean for the biller is that the biller gets a very early insight into what's happening with the invoice. If the customer accepts the invoice, the biller gets an indication that the bill or the invoice may be paid. So if the customer declines the request, the biller can get an indication that there is going to be a problem with the invoice. And the billers can also proactively engage with the customer to discuss their financial situation to help them through the bill payment process, which improves the overall customer engagement or the customer experience. And if if there is a request for an extension of the due date, the biller can get an indication that the payment is going to be late, and that they can factor into their cash flow management process, which helps them to make the cash flow management much more efficient. And then in the final stage of this journey, the customer can make the payment. And at this stage, customers have flexibility and choice how they are going to make the payment, whether via bank transfer, via open banking, via card rails. When they want to make the payment, whether the customer want to make the payment immediately or at a later point in time. And finally, how much the customer wants to pay. So there are options that customers can make the full bill payment amount, or the customers can make some part payments towards it. Now, this whole end-to-end journey provides a great deal of flexibility and control to the customers, which they don't have today. And also it's useful for billers to reduce some of their processing costs and also have better cash flow management and debt management process in place. Now, this high level journey is more or less similar in majority of the request to pay initiatives that we have seen so far. However, the implementation steps can vary. So if we take the example of UK request to pay and SEPA request to pay, when the customer receives a request to pay message following the UK framework, the customer has 5 options to respond to the request. And in no priority order, these options are either making the full payment or making part payment. The third option being requesting an extension of the due date. The fourth option is sending a note to the biller. And the final one is declining the request. Whereas if you look at the implementation or the SEPA request to pay scheme that has been launched, once the customer receives a request to pay message, the customer can either accept it or decline it. And if the customer choose to accept the request, the customer can accept immediately or accept at a later point in time. And for making the payment also, customer has the option to make the payment immediately or pay later. Now, in addition to these options, the payee can also enable some more flexible functionalities in the SEPA request to pay scheme, which is offering an option to the payer to set a different payment date, which is similar to requesting for an extension in the UK model. The payee can also enable a feature for the payer to make payments of different amount or make payments in installments, which is again similar to the pay part option in the UK model. So while there are differences in the implementation, one thing that is common between these two frameworks is that request to pay essentially is a secure communication mechanism. It's not a payment instrument on its own. So that means that a biller or a payer, if they want to adopt this service, the billers or the payers don't need to adopt a new payment instrument. They will have to adopt this new secure communication mechanism to avail the service or to provide the service. Now, if we look at how does the ecosystem or how does the ecosystem look like for request to pay? If you move to the next slide, please. So we have here some 2 examples of how the request to pay ecosystem may look like for the UK model and the SEPA request to pay scheme. On the left-hand side, you see the UK request to pay framework, and there are two key components in the UK request to pay ecosystem or the framework. One is the request to pay application, and the second one is request to pay repository. Now, billers can send the request to pay messages via billers request to pay application. Payers can receive their request to pay messages via the payers application. And these messages are essentially exchanged via the billers and the payer repository in the background. You can think of repositories as something conceptually similar to the email servers. So something that sends message from a sender to a receiver through a secure mechanism. Now, these are the two key components, and these are the two key elements that is required to enable the request to pay ecosystem as per the UK request to pay framework. And any provider, for example, a financial services provider, a technology provider, or a fintech service provider can provide the request to pay application or repository services, as long as they have the appropriate authorization to provide that service from PayUK or following PayUK's guideline. Now, looking at the SEPA request to pay framework, on the right-hand side, you can see what is similar to what SEPA calls a four-corner request to pay ecosystem, or a four-corner model, where payee and payer can exchange request to pay messages through their request to pay service providers. This model is not very different from the UK model. So according to the SEPA scheme and the rule book, any payment service providers or non-payment service providers, for example, commerce providers or e-invoicing platforms, can provide the RTP services for payers or payees. So this is essentially what the ecosystem needs to roll out the solution. And this framework, both the SEPA request to pay framework and the UK request to pay framework, can sit on top of the existing payments infrastructure. So there you can think of them as overlay services, which can work alongside the existing payments infrastructure or the payments mechanism that's available to them. So I'll stop here. That's a very high level overview of what request to pay is and what are the key components in the ecosystem. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any question, please log them in the QA section, and I'll hand over to Julian now.
Thanks, Sadiq. That was great. You obviously know the topic really well. I know you've blogged a lot about request to pay yourself, and that Accenture's worked with Pay UK pretty closely as well. So thank you for getting the session off to such an informative start. I'm just going to bring in Mike Chambers at this point. Mike's the chairman of AnswerPay. Mike, I'd be interested in your comments. Obviously, you were people may not know, but you were the first certified provider of request to pay in the UK. Be interesting to get your thoughts reflecting on what Sadiq has just outlined.
Yeah, thank you, Julian, and thank you also to Sudipta for sharing with us. It was great to hear your perspective on request to pay. I think I'd start off by saying that there's an old adage that a payment is a payment is a payment. The argument goes, at the end of the day, someone is wanting to pay and someone is waiting to be paid. Now, of course, it's true, there may be many flavors of payments. You know, a payment might have different processing attributes in their cycles. They might be push, they might be pull, might be RTGS, might be deferred net settlement. But in essence, a payment is just a simple act of a debit with a corresponding credit. However, at AnswerPay, we believe that request to pay challenges this decades-old adage, because we believe that request to pay adds a payment request and a communications channel to an underlying payment. Now, with that backdrop, you might rightly ask why, as the former CEO of the UK's largest payment system and a long-time advocate of direct debit, why have I reinvented myself to become the chairman of the UK's first certified RTP provider? You might ask, isn't it a bit like a footballer moving from United to City or Tottenham to Arsenal? Have I just jumped ship and joined the UK's biggest ACH arch rivals? Now, spoiler alert, I'd say no. You know, request to pay is a payments disruptor. That is clear. but I firmly believe that request to pay coexists with other payment types. In particular, request to pay and direct debit can be complementary rather than competitive in the payment marketplace. And of course, RTP is an overlay service that reuses an acronym. RTP, as request to pay, is intrinsically linked to RTP real-time payments. So at AnswerPay, we've been exploring some really what we believe to be compelling use cases for request to pay. I haven't got time to delve into them in any detail or in all of them, but just touching briefly on a handful. One downside of modern digital payments is the introduction of new fraud vectors. And these fraud vectors put a greater burden on consumers as a target. We believe that RTP has the power to disrupt authorized push payment fraud. We believe that because with RTP at both endpoints of the payments data transfer are secure. So that means that not only is the communication channel itself secure, but also the message itself can be trusted. And another case that we've been looking at is that in the context of not-for-profit and charities, you know, the financial ask for an NFP or a charity might be different in the context of that charity, but the opportunities to digitize the donation, empower the donator, remove friction from the process and be flexible is as true for a donation as it is for a payment. Sadiq mentioned SMEs and cash flows and some of the issues surrounding SMEs. And one of the biggest killers of SMEs in the UK is cash flow. The more insight an SME has of the propensity to pay, the more control an SME will have over its cash flow. You know, that traditional invoice on a 30-day payment term really doesn't help because often there's no communication from the point at which the invoice is issued through to the payment or perhaps the default of the payment occurring. And we believe that's where request to pay can really help. You know, when that payer receives their invoice, they can respond with different options and establish a dialogue through to that payment being made or being challenged. And of course, request to pay provides payers with an easy way to choose who they pay, when they pay, and how they pay. And through that, we believe that level of control provided within request to pay supports the creation of a financially empowered society. A fair question from today's audience would be around the benefits for the payment service provider in adopting for request to pay. And I want to look at that in two aspects. The first is the benefits for corporate banks and direct debit bureaus. You know, differentiation in payments is hard. We know that, but request to pay allows differentiation to occur at the corporate bank or in the direct debit bureau. You have the opportunity to launch a service in your name rather than a payment method run by somebody else. Request to pay is an opportunity to cut costs by having the payment method that helps your biller reach the payers that others can't reach. Request to pay allows you to streamline a process. You don't have to plug into every alternative payment method going. You can future-proof your connection by connecting into the request to pay ecosystem. And finally, for corporate banks, request to pay provides opportunity to build new services around the robust reconciliation. And we believe that's unique to request to pay because of the immutable transaction IDs. But let's flip the coin from the corporate bank or the direct debit bureau and think about the retail bank. Mobile and digital is no longer just an add-on to your current account product. You know, thanks to open banking, customers have new ways of interfacing to their current accounts. And from a retail bank perspective, what better way to secure the ongoing customer relationship than by enabling them to receive their bills in your application, because that brings the necessity of interacting with your app on a regular basis. And if we think about the adoption of request to pay and the build of request to pay in the UK and Europe and other geographies, from a retail bank point of view, think about land grab. You know, in the early days of request to pay, as with any new service, customer education is absolutely critical. And billers like British Gas and Vodafone, it would be necessary for them to tell their customers which apps an RTP can be presented through and which apps they might want to download to make a payment. From a retail bank perspective, we have to make sure that their app is available in that context of request to pay. And of course, from a retail bank's point of view, once a customer has selected their provider and they're regularly engaging with their provider in the context of making their payments, they're much less likely to churn. Just as I come to a conclusion, I just wanted to think about the regulatory picture. At AnswerPay, we believe that Request to Pay plays well into the payment system regulators' agenda. If you look at their work plan, the PSR's work plan for 2021-22, and look at the things that they're really focusing on, you'll see that Request to Pay has the option to address both the malicious payee and the malicious redirection challenges that are outlined by the PSR in their desire to reduce APP scams. Request to Pay supports promoting competition in marketplaces, which is a key priority in the new payment strategy that's presently out for consultation. Where RTP, it reduces APP fraud and looks at making less fraud occurring within payments, RTP will reduce the occasions for the contingent reimbursement model to be utilised, dealing with things pre-event rather than post-event. If you consider the new payment architecture, you'll see that the PSR wants the MPA delivered in a way that drives innovation and competition in payment system that benefits everyone. RTP as an overlay service sitting above the payment channels supports this objective. RTP supports the PSR's objectives that consumers and businesses should feel confident and suitably protected when making interbank payments. And in a digital way, RTP supports the PSR's access to cash objective. And that particular objective states that everyone should have a good choice of how to make payments in ways that work for them. So in conclusion, I'd say we live in an era where individuals want what they want when they want it. And bill payments haven't escaped this game-changing transformation in attitudes and behaviours. Today, bill payers want to have more control over which bills they pay and when they pay them. They also want the ability to settle payments digitally on their smart devices whenever it suits them. So against this backdrop, RTP offers value across the board. Firstly, for billers, by being predictable and controllable cash flows. For a payer's perspective, providing an empowered experience personal to them, and for payment providers, enabling them to support their meeting client demands. Thanks for your time. I'll hand back to Julian.
Thanks, Mike. What a great run through of the many benefits to many different stakeholders of Request to Pay. And I guess coming back to one of your early points, it's certainly it's notable that with your background as chief exec of Bax that you've decided that this is a sector that you want to get involved in so heavily. So that's great. And I suppose one of the questions that comes to mind when you hear about Request to Pay for the first time, certainly did for me, is will people use it? And that example from Sabita's presentation, that half of the that BPay in Australia is the most popular payment mechanism, was a really good one in that sense. I'm going to just bring in Nigel now from FIS. Nigel, I alluded to it earlier on, and obviously Sadiq presented the SEPA framework as well, but we had quite a big announcement on the European standard earlier this month. Can you maybe share some thoughts on what that's going to mean for the market, and also which countries within Europe do you think are likely to be the early adopters?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Julian, and thanks to everyone for participating and listening to us today. FIS, as you know, probably already is a very major provider of infrastructure to banks for their payments transactions, whether it's account to account or using card. And therefore we provide the software that makes these types of solutions work, and also provide services using that software for the smaller banks for them to be able to take advantage. I'm based here out in France. Those you can hear, I was originally born in the UK, but I've lived out here for 25 years now. And here in the European Union, the SEPA and the Europe EBA have written hence a rule book for rolling out Request to Pay into the market. But what is the big driver for that? Well, you can imagine that here in France, we have very, very many invoices going from company to company and also from company to government. And so really making that much more automatic and ensuring that there's a payment actually promptly to each invoice is a key issue, both for companies as well as for government. So that's why back in 2015, the European Union put through a European directive to make the use of electronic invoicing obligatory, and steadily companies are rolling that out into their local law. Here in France, we passed a law just last year in November, and from 2023, e-invoicing, electronic invoicing, will be obligatory. But it's good to have an electronic invoice, but if you don't get a response to say whether the person's going to pay or not, that's only half of the job done. And in fact, France added into its law, and that will be published in September this year, to make the response obligatory as well. So in fact, from 2023 here in France, we will see electronic invoicing obligatory for B2B invoices, as well as B2G, business to government, from 2023, including what we call invoice response, or here we would know that as request to pay. And why is that important? Because the chief stakeholders, obviously, firstly, it's the businesses. That's going to help them to get their cash in quicker, which is a major issue. But it also gives them certainty on when that cash is arriving. So managing a business is made much easier. But the second key stakeholder in every invoice, or at least in the domestic invoicing, is of course the government. Domestic invoices, or most of them, have VAT added to them. And so the government here in France has put into place a centralized platform, and copies of the electronic invoices will have to go through that centralized platform. That means the government will see the VAT being charged, and they will know when that VAT should be available to be paid to them. So you can see that the government, as a major stakeholder, is driving the arrival of e-invoicing, and hence driving also the arrival of request to pay. The same is the case in Italy. Italy already, in fact, is 3 years ahead of France in terms of e-invoicing. That's already obligatory in Italy. And they're also now looking to roll in the request to pay as part of that process. So two of the key markets in the European Union are already on the track, and request to pay is therefore creating a lot of interest. The other key difference as well between the UK and the European Union is that the scheme in the European Union is very much an interbank scheme. It's obviously run and through the EBA clearing and EPC's central platform. So that means that the messages going from payee to payer are standardized on ISO 20022. So therefore they can go anywhere within the European Union and be understood and be responded to, which obviously makes cross-border invoicing and the tracking of cross-border payments much easier. And secondly, at a domestic level, we're now seeing local domestic players putting into place a local domestic platform so that those local domestic invoices can also be tracked. You may have seen the announcement from eBayPay in Spain last week. They are putting into place a centralized platform for the domestic B2B transfers, and then afterwards that will also be connected into the European network. So you can see that with the scope and the drive from the EBA and EPC in standardization, and secondly, the imposition from governments in order to get their hands on the VAT money and make sure that they get that money back, you can see that request to pay is obviously a subject which is going to come, and in the next 3 to 5 years, we will see paper invoices and PDF of invoices disappearing in Europe and replaced by electronic equivalents, along with request to pay. Did you want to add any other question, Julian?
I was interested in whether you think any of the particular countries in Europe are going to be quick adopters. Again, Savita talked about the Baltics in her session, but
yeah, well, for a starting point, you should be aware there are 28 founder members of the EPC scheme. So there are 28 major banks across the whole of Europe that have invested in getting that rule book up and running and getting that platform to be put into place. So you can expect that across the major banks in Europe, we will see adoption from at least from those 28.
Yeah.
But as I mentioned, you then accompany that with local legislation as it becomes mandated in each country. And we can see therefore that Italy, France, Spain are those countries where we're going to see the adoption very quickly, because basically the corporates in the market have no choice about ultimately moving across to providing this type of service. One of the other points that I didn't mention in the European scheme is that it's very open. It's not only banks that can register and provide the service, but it's also, and I think Sudipta, you mentioned this as well, the payment initiation service providers. So fintechs that are providing payment initiation, and indeed companies that are also just exclusively in the e-invoicing area are also now able in the scheme to sign up and register. So we will see new entrants into the market providing payment initiation, companies that previously only did the management of invoices, but they are going to be adding in this payment initiation. So those places where there is large entities doing already a lot of work in e-invoicing, then we will see that rolling out. In Scandinavia, there have already been schemes over the last 4 or 5 years in the local currencies in Scandinavia. And then again, the banks there are now adding the European scheme to their services to provide a complete offer, including through the P27 scheme, which is for the Nordic countries.
Brilliant. Well, fascinating stuff. Thanks, Nigel. Thank you very much. So I guess so far we've had a great overview of what Request to Pay is. We've heard a lot about the benefits to different stakeholders. Things that have been coming through as themes, I think, of flexibility, more engagement, sort of transparency and visibility, and obviously the improvements to cash flow. I'm going to introduce Nigel Garner now from Answer Digital. Nigel, I suppose the point is that this isn't, it's not a new sector, it's a new thing that we're bringing to an existing sector. So from a tech perspective, how's this all shaping up for the payment providers? What are they doing?
Yeah, thanks, Julian. And I've got to say, thank you for creating a panel with 2 Nigels on it. I think this is probably the first and only time today will certainly be a memorable event for that, if nothing else. So just to introduce myself and Answer Digital a little bit. So we're a digital engineering organization that focuses predominantly on bringing in innovative digital solutions to the finance and the health sector. We've been involved in Request to Pay since before it even took that time. And that title. So we've got quite a good and deep understanding of what it takes to engage with this from a technical perspective and what it really means. We've heard a lot today in terms of the opportunities of Request to Pay, but I can completely understand and appreciate that for a lot of the people listening, then the reality of how to engage with that and how to engage with it from their business might be quite a daunting task. It seems like there's a barrier there to start getting up and working with this technology. I mean, every organization is different. Some organizations are on a journey to cloud adoption, some haven't even started yet. The majority of the industry remains on an aging platform with some quite old applications. The pace of IT change within those organizations is slow and it's hard to innovate. If you couple that with the internal pressures, the existing business roadmaps, the challenges in delivery, then it can seem quite an interesting problem in terms of how to leverage this and how to really get and innovate and take advantage of this opportunity that's been presented out to the market. But that said, none of these problems or challenges are particularly new. There's no real barrier to engaging or to working with Request to Pay. There's the obvious partner versus build debate. I mean, if you have large amounts of underutilized IT resource within the organization, I can definitely give some really good pointers on what it takes to build an RTP repository, and it's not an easy path. But if we work and assume for a second that an organization was to take a collaborative approach and take down a partner route, then what would that actually mean to working with Request to Pay, to getting on board and starting to pilot it out? Well, a lot of the request to pay solutions are SaaS or cloud hosted, which means that you don't need to start purchasing or provisioning hardware in order to dip your toe in the water. If you wanted to engage and to partner with us and to start working it out, then get working with a partner, understand, communicate, build the relationship with them. And fundamentally, why not even take something as simple as an existing output file from your existing core IT solution, something controversial like a direct debit file, work with your partner to be able to send that to them and allow them to integrate and build that into request to pay and deliver that through. Engage with a way that means that you don't have to drive out core platform change. You don't have to go against those IT internal obstacles that you normally need to face. If you did take that approach, then there's plenty of options in terms of request to pay, what it means in terms of the operational usage, and there's several kind of lightweight use cases, lightweight operational processes, how that can be supported within the organization without having to drive out large scale change. If you did want to organize it, integrate deep into your IT landscape, then RTP is a sort of API first solution. Makes it very easy and secure to integrate with and to embed within the existing applications. But by taking a partner solution, it really lightens the burden of doing so. So, for example, the certification of an RTP repository means Sadiq explained earlier the different components and mechanisms. And while it was a great learning curve to go through that specification process to help shape the spec to complete the inter-repository testing exception, it's definitely something that should be avoided by people. It's something that if you can take a repository that's out there in the market, work with that partner and establish that as a pilot capability within the business, then it makes a lot of sense to do so. The other point we heard today about the SEPA and there's different approaches between the UK and the European model. I think one of the things that I definitely reflect on there is learning from the open banking integrations, looking at, again, the partnership model, the challenges for organizations as to why would you invest and deliver into several different standards and processes as part of that. Why not integrate that once? Why not engage with the partner, work with them, and let the partner take the heavy lifting there, take that fintech approach and deliver that through so that you can get the advantages of these various different market standards, the various different opportunities that mean to your business, while only having to integrate singularly to a single entity. It's kind of my take, my view on that in terms of how to avoid some of the key challenges.
Thanks, Nigel. Thanks very much. Yeah, interesting to get that other perspective on the impact of rolling this out within the FS sector. Thank you. So we're going to move into a sort of Q&A session now. Now, I can see there's lots of questions from the audience. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. We're going to do our best to work our way through some of those. Any that we don't get to, then I'm sure the AnswerPay team will be happy to take them away. So first of all, I'm going to ask this of all the panelists. After kind of hearing each other's contributions today, where do you stand on whether payment providers should be taking action now, or maybe kind of taking more of a wait and see? I guess it's the lead or lag. What's your thoughts? And maybe Sabita, we could go back to you to kick things off.
So if I share my point of view, I think request to pay is already overdue in the industry. And the reason I say so, if you look at the impact we had or we have seen during the COVID, a lot of people or the UK consumers and businesses have faced challenges during the lockdown to make their regular bill payments. Now, we saw the providers came forward to provide some flexible options to the customers, either to cancel or extend their credit, cancel regular payment arrangement, or discussing alternate payments arrangements. All of these features are quite similar to what is available via request to pay. So we have seen there is a real need for customers to have the flexibility, have those options available to them when they need it. So that's why I think the organizations should look more actively into the request to pay and consider it.
It sounds like you're in the lead rather than lag camp.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great, Mike. What do you think?
I think I just add a very little bit to Sudipta. I think that, we live in an increasingly digital society. A lot of folk, whether in the gig economy or regular incomes, have to try and manage their payments and manage their money. I think that you've got to get to a point where, we're in control of what we're doing. There's a great expectation that their banks will innovate and the banks will provide needs and they will adopt new technologies and open banking, and particularly retail banks, if they don't get on board, they'll be left behind by their competitors who are providing the digital payments to support the digital society that we all live in.
Okay, I'm going to put you down as a lead as well. Do you know what? I'm going to assume we've got so many questions that are coming through. I'm going to assume everyone's going to say lead because you're all the advocates, because that's why you're here. So I'm going to move on to a different question. Nigel from FIS. Everyone talks about London Underground being a really key moment for contactless adoption, certainly in the UK. What do you think are going to be the key use cases for request to pay? What's going to be the tipping point, do you think?
It's a very good question, because there are 14 different subsets of use cases, right the way from B2C all the way through to B2G, which are listed in the EPC rulebook. And of course, you can imagine in the future doing a request to pay in a supermarket and just paying directly from your account to the supermarket's account. However, short term, obviously the quick wins are going to be in those organizations that are already sending out large numbers of invoices and need to get those invoices paid quicker. So the key use case short term, and the one which will be the easiest to get up and running, is definitely going to be the B2B e-invoicing. Plus the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that's also being driven by legislation across Europe and certainly in countries like France and Italy. So we will see, certainly. If you think about it as well, if you compare request to pay to what WhatsApp has done to messaging from person to person, I mean, hardly any of us send post anymore and write a physical letter and send it and hope someone responds. Most of us send a WhatsApp and get a response immediately. That's the type of change that we're going to look at, and what's going to happen in the B2B invoicing area, as businesses will be able to send messages out with a request to pay and within 10 seconds, get an instant response.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess that will become the norm for organizations, and we'll all become used to being able to deal that way, and then we'll wonder why we had such an antiquated way of doing things before.
Indeed.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks, Nigel. And so, Nigel Garner, we talked a lot about where request to pay is today and what some of the kind of immediate developments are going to be. What do you think's going to be coming next? What's the future, do you feel, for request to pay?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because obviously request to pay is currently only at the start of its journey and starting to fulfill some of its potential as to what it could do. Fundamentally, request to pay is about engagement, it's around communication. And if you take those two principles, there's a lot of different directions you could take them in to deliver out some quite interesting business value. If you take the communication, for example, then it is a conversational message. It's back and forth, etc., as part of the standards and as part of the way it engages with users. So what if you took some relatively well mature static existing technologies such as chatbots and the kind of tech that drives Alexa and all the rest of it, and start applying those to the response to the conversation? So you actually then create engagement, you create the conversation through in the messages that are flowing back and forth. The free text options within request to pay certainly provide some quite interesting options in terms of where that might be taken in the future. The other one is, the simple one, is around engagement. If you take engagement as the basis of how to innovate with tech, then simple things like understanding the payer, understanding their working patterns, their shifts, and actually adjusting the push of the message to be at a point when they're most likely to pay. So if somebody works nights, for example, and you send a message out overnight to them, they're working, they're not likely to engage with that, they're not likely to engage with the bill that they receive. So knowing what you know about the user, knowing what you can learn about them, then enable that, make it a case of changing the message times so you can match the pattern, the payment pattern, the cycle of that person.
Sure. Okay. Very good. So the chatbots can maybe build on that engagement opportunity, and then we might have more intelligent, sort of actionable insights coming through from data in future as well. Okay, let's try and tackle some of the questions from the audience. I mean, thanks everybody for all the questions. It's great to know that there's so many things that need addressing here. I think a question for Sabita would be the question which came from Jagdish Undaya Kumar. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Do you see the greatest opportunity amongst B2B payments or consumer payments? I guess we've talked mainly about B2B so far today. Sabita, what do you think?
Request to pay can be applied in both B2B and B2C context. So I think Nigel mentioned some of the use cases that are possible where it can be applied to regular consumer bill payment context. And also, if you think of businesses paying invoices to businesses, it can be applied to that context as well. And my personal favorites are some of the use cases that I have seen in Singapore, where request to pay has been adopted by the hospitals to collect payments towards healthcare services. For example, if someone visits the hospital for consultation or orders home delivery of medicines, the hospitals use pay collect solution to collect the payment towards it. So there are many different use cases possible with request to pay, and it can be applied in any context where there is a bill payment or an invoice payment is involved between two parties.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Mike, a question for you, I think, from Hugh Mullen. To what extent does request to pay provide an alternative to card rails for payments? Ultimately, can it place a competitive constraint on card schemes and interchange fees, or are the use cases for request to pay not really in the patch of the card schemes? Is it a disruptor for card payments? What do you think?
Well, absolutely. Thanks, Hugh, for the question. Good question, Hugh. It is a disruptor. I think there are a number of ways of answering this. I think from a request to pay, as we've talked about, is an overlay service. It's a message. In itself, it's payment agnostic. So a request to pay can trigger the ability to pay by many payment types. Might be faster payments, might be cards. So it is agnostic. However, if you think about it from the perspective of the retail bank, utilizing maybe a faster payment or an instant payment does have economies from a cost point of view rather than using cards. So therefore it disrupts the cards. It's not for request to pay to replace any competitive constraint on the card schemes and interchange fees, but ultimately as somebody making a payment, if I'm paying for that payment, I want to make it as efficiently, as cost efficiently as I can. If I'm a retail bank offering the payment types, I'd quite naturally point them to the payment leg or payment channel that's cost effective for me to use while still meeting the needs of my customer.
Great. So it's another option rather than a replacer. Okay.
Julian, maybe I can just add as well, within the new European card scheme, the EPI initiative, which has been launched, both instant payment and request to pay are seen as logical extensions of why EPI will come to be used widely in Europe, because although it also covers card scheme, obviously there's a card scheme for EPI, it also will be linked directly into the rails for instant payment and for request to pay. So it's also, as Mike mentioned, it doesn't directly replace, but it provides an alternative. And therefore, for certain use cases, that's going to be a cost-effective alternative.
Sure. Nigel, can I give you one of the follow-on questions here as well? I don't know who asked the question, it was anonymous, but how will it impact point of sale?
Well, as Sudipta mentioned, request to pay can be put into place both for consumers as well as for businesses. And indeed, we've had discussions already with retailers that are very interested to look at using it in point of sale as an alternative to paying what they perceive as high fees on card-based transactions. Obviously, if I go into the supermarket, I get to the desk with my caddy, and the person at the desk then asks me to send. He or she could just send to me a request to pay, which I receive on my phone, and within 10 seconds, the money could be validated to be transferred to her account, to the merchant's account, and therefore the merchant gets their money onto their bank account very, very much quicker than using a card scheme. So certainly in the medium term, we will see a request to pay also being used in point of sale.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So let's see, we've got some other questions. I don't know, this one might be another one for you as well, actually, Nigel, and then I'll promise I'll ask someone else a question after that. But how do the banks make money from request to pay? That was a question from Sid Vasily.
Yeah, that's a very pertinent question, because the business model for instant payment has been problematic, notably here in France, because banks are trying to force people to pay €1 for each instant payment transaction. And that is obviously stunting growth. Whereas with request to pay, it's much more an opportunity for the bank to grow its value-added service to its corporate users. So the banks that have large numbers of corporate customers can go to those corporate customers, propose to them to bring request to pay as well as maybe an e-invoicing service, and therefore add value-added services to the merchants and businesses. So therefore, they would find a business model from charging it back to those enterprises that will logically gain from quicker access to cash.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Sabita, I think this may be a question for you, but if it's not, feel free to bounce it straight back at me. Bob Ford's asked about legislation. Europe seems to be driven by legislation rather than the UK appears to be less regulatory driven. Wonder if you'd agree with that, and if you do, how can the UK get a more regulated approach to ensure take up?
Okay, I'll try to answer that. With any of the innovative solutions that we have seen in the market recently, whether it's request to pay or whether it's open banking, we have seen different flavors of the initiatives in different geographies. In some places, there are regulators who have come forward to drive the adoption. In some places, the environment itself is so innovative that they are introduced as a more innovative initiatives. So, certainly if regulators are involved, there is a push to adopt the service because of the mandates that comes with the regulation. But what I personally feel that the solutions like request to pay, open banking, they are naturally quite appealing because of the benefits and the potential they offer. And we are likely to see adoptions as long as some of the forward thinking or for some of the most innovative organizations come forward and start driving the adoption.
Brilliant, thank you for picking that one up. Great. Okay, well look, we're pretty much out of time, so I'm going to wrap things up. Just want to say thank you to everybody who's attended, especially for all the questions and comments. Really appreciated. I want to say a big thank you to AnswerPay for creating the event today, for being the sponsor, to our speakers Nigel, Mike, and Savita. I guess, just try and sum up what we've been hearing. There's many benefits that request to pay can bring to different stakeholders who are involved in the making or receiving of payments. The ones that I've kept coming back to were flexibility, visibility, more engagement and communication, and improved cash flow. I think it's clear from the speakers that we've heard from that this is not just a UK initiative. There's a worldwide use cases in other countries, other regions, and as we kind of look forward, it sounds like we can look to expect more influence from some of the big technology trends like AI, which will manifest itself in the form of things like chatbots and actionable data. So thank you to everybody for joining. Thanks again to the speakers and to AnswerPay, and I hope you'll all enjoy the rest of the day. We have recorded today, and so you'll be able to watch back if you've had to miss any part of the discussion. Thanks very much. Good day, everyone.
Thank you.